Despite how much it hurt, how nothing could ever be the same, Dr. Madden took care of me throughout the process, during which I'd slipped in and out of paranoid psychosis. It was a choice, but it kind of wasn't really at all. His eyes were open and unneat at the first tiny almost sound that made its way out my mouth. Just as he'd done 100 times before, he sat up straight in his chair and edged forward a little, allowing himself to move as close to me as was professional. This was where he paused, with an elbow braced on a knee and hand touching his face, hovering and watching, waiting. It wasn't so different from any other time, really. The dance and a stage and words, choreographed and predictable. I could do the steps in my sleep. It had taken a couple of months for me to even be comfortable in the same room as Dr. Madden after hypnotherapy, always making excuses about other appointments, plans I had to keep and not wanting to waste his time. Despite my inability to really lie to him, he hadn't ever pressed the subject. However much he wanted to ask, he just let it go. It had taken 6 months before I even told him. The reason I didn't want to stay became obvious after a couple of weeks into the time following the first 2 months I was seeing him. The 1000th time he'd snapped me out of hypnosis, breathing like I'd been drowning seconds before, shaking, scared and clinging to him in tears. Diana Goodman, for all my unease and impracticality, he'd never expected that. It shocked him, to say the least, along with the realization that this was what I'd been hiding from all that time, but I had obviously felt it necessary to hide it from him. The last thought would leave an uneasy mark on the tenuously thin trust he'd built between us, seeing the confirming shame in my eyes. Although the memories became obvious in themselves, the restless way I'd talk during hypnosis, the words Dr. Madden could just make out and the way my fingers would grip the arms of the chair, it still took months of him calmly comforting me without quite knowing why, of patiently waiting until I was ready to talk about it. And it was hard, his mind running a riot in his head, filling in the blanks with a psychiatrist's imagination, coming up with a dozen worst-case scenarios and everything in between. Whether it was the 6-month milestone, the fact that I wanted to give something back to him, or just that it took that long to trust the doctor enough. He never asked that, either. During hypnosis, Dr. Madden wasn't ever quite sure whether to wake me up, for 2 reasons. The first is that it was hard to tell whether or not I was caught in the middle or the beginning of a memory, but I knew he had this strange desire to pull me out of it, and spare me any of the pain that I may or may not have felt. The second is that there was no telling how I would react when he hesitantly snapped his fingers or called my name once, then more firmly until I jerked back into reality. More often than not, the tension would drain from my face, replaced with a grateful little smile while my gaze, darting and uncertain, relaxed after being fixed on his for a while. Sometimes, though, I was more than just a little shaken. Anger automatically misdirected at Dr. Madden, because it was easier than acknowledging that I was affected by the memories, just because he was there, and it was easier somehow. He would tell me I was allowed to be angry, to hate psychiatry and medication, and, for a few hours, days, it was okay. Psychiatry and medication were my religion, and people hated God sometimes when they hurt. And this hurt. For me at least, it was easier. Dr. Madden, on the other hand, was left with a bitter self-loathing feeling rising from his stomach as he selfishly considered for a few seconds not snapping me awake, to go places I wasn't ready to go, or to avoid my eyes cutting through him with that angry stare, that was only going to get worse when I saw the way he looked back at me, sympathy and compassion bordering on pity. Minutes after pushing out of the chair, striding out of the room after spewing words along the lines of "fuck you" or "it isn't your business" in his general direction, I always came back. I knew he could hear me pacing outside his office door, running words through my head and hating myself for my lack of self-control, but he waited, ever patient, knowing the pattern of days like this. We were well practiced by then. I always came back, regret clear on my features as I murmured unnecessary apologies. Sometimes he would listen and nod. Most days he would shush me and we'd wait as the air in the room shifted and we were both more comfortable. The actions that followed were a well-rehearsed pattern, my face pressed into his shoulder and his hand on my back as I listened to his heartbeat and cried, the steady rhythm giving me something real to focus on. We didn't need to talk. We talked enough, hours spent analyzing and going over memories long past. As much as he'd made a living out of words, phrases spun into gentle reassurance or questions, there was only so much that words could do. The rest was time. Time and this. Despite the helplessness he felt and the hopeless that was mine, he could do this. It's all he could do, and not very often, but sometimes it was enough.